Everybody wants to have positive change. Everybody expects to have positive change. Everybody believes that they need to improve their learning environments. And yet, change and embracing change or innovation is a very difficult thing to do. And we often don't realize why innovation initiatives or change initiatives are so difficult to do. And the literature is quite clear on this. If we go back to the work of John Cotter in Harvard in the 90s and early 2000s, he pointed out that 70 to sometimes 85% of all change or innovation initiatives will fail. More recent research in 2015, 2016 has pointed to the fact that it may be as high as 90 to 95% of change initiatives fail. Which means very few people are implementing effective change strategies, effective change initiatives. Why? Why? Well, what does the literature say? If we go back to the literature, we go back to the research, there's usually 5 key points, but I'm going to summarize them because I think 2 of them can be combined together. And the literature points to 3 key things. It takes time to change culture. And culture is very, very powerful. Those are the 2 factors. The second factor I think is extremely important that the literature points to is that quite often we don't plan our change initiatives, our innovation plans effectively. We just don't really look at what is really involved. We don't have an effective or thorough plan. And then the third component is, and this is a big one that Cotter talks about a lot, is we don't communicate enough. Cotter argues that if you think you've communicated effectively enough your change strategy or your innovation strategy, you need to do it 10 times more. And that's a big challenge. In this first video, we're going to take a look at this first issue of that cultural perspective as to why change is so hard to bring about and why it's so hard to have your innovation plan move forward because of culture. In 2 subsequent videos, we're going to take a look at a greater detail at innovation planning, and then we're going to take a look at communication and how do you effectively communicate and how often do you need to communicate in that third video. So this is going to be a 3-part series that we're going to be addressing this. And the first one is really about the culture. And I think one of the most effective ways to look at culture, especially for educators, is if we take a look at what Jen Cross has talked about in terms of her myths of change, behavior change, especially when it comes to educational settings. Her first myth that education is going to change behavior. We're educators. That's what we do. We educate people. We give them knowledge. We put them into PD, and we know it's going to change them. And yet, research shows it doesn't work that well. The second myth that Cross points out is that you need to change attitudes to change behavior. Well, we all believe that. Everybody needs to adjust people's attitude. We know that if we put people in PD, it will change their attitude. And guess what? The behavior will change. But yet, we know from practical experience that's another myth. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to change the behavior first, and then the attitude follows. And then the third myth that Cross points out is that people really know what motivates them. Yeah, we know it's the data. People want to, people are motivated by data. And that is connected to that first myth. Well, if we just inform people and point them to what the data says, well, that's going to bring about change. Doesn't always work that way. What are your thoughts on these myths and this idea that as educators, we know how to change a problem, and that's just educate people? What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Thibodeau?
I think there's a level of discomfort with change. And I think that's why it takes time. And changing the culture tends to be, sort of, a process that you have to work with so many factors, so many variables. And I think we just have to allow ourselves as opportunities to realize that change does take a little time, take a little bit of work. And if we're working on one piece of that puzzle, the big change impact we want to make, we have to kind of shift and move that puzzle piece around to get it to where it's going to fit in this bigger picture that we see. So we have to allow ourselves those opportunities to make mistakes, fail forward, and it takes a bit of planning behind that. So, when I say, we talk about ineffective planning and some of these factors that contribute to why change is difficult, that front end investment is so important to really, think things through, get some people involved that can help you with your change initiative, and really get down to sometimes the core root of what is it that's causing me this level of discomfort or getting in my way that I can't move forward. So you want to plan for these things ahead of time so that you can get through them when they do crop up and pop up. Lack of communication, so important that we always go back and like you said earlier, discuss, share, talk with other people, get our ideas out there, work through some of the challenges, some of the barriers, some of the advantages, recognize some of the disadvantages. Because when we do these things well and we get to the core of what we're looking to do and moving those ideas forward, I think then we start to impact change and things start to move. And I think in our next couple of videos, we'll address some of that bigger picture innovation planning and communication and go down that pathway.
I think you've really summarized the key ideas, and I want to go back to that first point, that this notion of knowledge or education is going to change everything. And this is, I think, where we're going to spend the most of our time in this video. As educators, that's where we live. That's what we do. We educate people. We inform. We give them knowledge. We give them information. We create an environment. We put people into PD, and we believe that that's going to bring about the change. And yet, we're learning that that isn't necessarily the case, because we're only addressing a third of the person. If we look at the work of Benjamin Bloom, he identified the fact that you've got a cognitive domain, an affective domain, and a psychomotor domain, meaning the individual is comprised of sort of these three components. And yet, when we do the PD sessions and we believe that by providing effective PD, we're going to change people, we're only addressing that cognitive domain. We're only addressing the head. And we've learned from the research and from our experience, the head won't go where the heart hasn't been. So don't just address a third of the individual, the cognitive domain, and believe that if we educate people, put them in PD, it'll change. No, you've got to engage the heart. You've got to engage the affective domain. And the other component, the behavior part, you have to have people actually doing something. This isn't new ideas. This is based on old research, old experience, is well established. It's just that we often move forward without taking the time to look back and seeing what the research really says. So if you want to be successful in any innovation planning and initiative, you've got to recognize you can't just do the PD. You've got to address the head. You've got to address the heart. You have to actually physically engage people to get them to do something if you want that behavior to change. And as you had mentioned and confirmed, this takes time. It takes time to change a culture. It takes time to change the attitudes. But those attitudes come about by changing the behavior. And those behaviors come about by actually getting people to do something different. So hopefully we're busting a few educational myths here. And we might be making you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. That's part of the learning process too. Learning means you're going to be a little bit uncomfortable. And guess what? We're going to point you to the research. We're going to point you to the articles that support these ideas, because we're not just making this up. This is based on well-established research. So if we want to bring about effective change and implement that successful innovation planning process, we really need to take a look at the fact that we've got to change that culture. That takes time. We have to actually change behaviors before attitudes will change. We have to actually build a plan to do that. And we have to have people physically engaged in doing these things. And the last component we'll deal with in the final video is the head won't go where the heart hasn't been. You've got to address the heart, not just the head. No, don't misunderstand. Don't ignore the head and only focus on the heart. No, you've got to find that balance. It's a balance of the head, the heart, and action and behavior if you really want to bring about effective innovation planning and an innovation plan that will actually be realized. Remember, this takes time, and hopefully we're giving you some details and some resources that'll help you be successful in moving your strategy forward.